In March of 1986, on a narrow mountain road outside Lisbon, a car that Ford had built to be one of the fastest, most advanced machines on the planet left the road at well over 100 miles an hour and drove straight into a crowd of people who had done nothing wrong except stand a little too close to the edge of the tarmac to watch their heroes go by. In the seconds that followed, 3 of those people would be dead, more than 30 would be injured, and the entire sport of world rallying would be changed forever. This is not a story about a bad car. This is not a story about a reckless driver. This is the story of how a small group of engineers built something so far ahead of its time that nobody, not even the people who designed it, fully understood what they had created until it was far too late. By the time this video ends, you are going to understand exactly how the Ford RS200 came to exist, why it was arguably the most brilliant piece of engineering to ever come out of the Group B era, and how it ended up carrying the weight of a tragedy that, in truth, was never really its fault. You are going to hear about the phone engineers who built a rally car unlike anything before it, the impossible technical decisions that made it faster off the line than a Formula One car, and the exact chain of events, second by second, that turned a rally stage into a nightmare that no one who was there that day has ever fully forgotten. And stay with me until the end, because there is a twist to this story that most people never talk about. A final piece of the RS200's history that changes the way you look at this car completely. To understand why the RS200 exists at all, you have to go back to a moment when motorsport basically had no rules. In 1982, the FIA introduced a new category for rallying called Group B, and Group B was, by design, almost lawless. There was no meaningful limit on horsepower, no real restriction on technology, and only one true requirement. A manufacturer had to build 200 road-going versions of a car before it was allowed to go rallying with a competition version. That single rule, meant to keep things grounded in reality, ended up doing the opposite. Manufacturers realized they didn't need to build 200 practical cars. They just needed to build 200 cars, period. So they built rockets. Audi built the Quattro and reshaped rallying forever with 4-wheel drive. Lancia built the 37 and then the terrifying Deltas 4. Peugeot built the mid-engine 205 Turbo 16. Each of these cars weighed barely more than a small hatchback, but produced more power than a contemporary supercar, and they were being driven flat out, inches from spectators, on public roads that had barely been closed off. It was breathtaking to watch. It was also, in hindsight, an accident waiting to happen on a global stage. Ford wanted in on this madness, but Ford had a problem. Their existing rally weapon, an evolution of the Escort called the RS200 700T, was a disaster. It was rear-wheel drive in an era that had just discovered four-wheel drive was the future. It was based on a production car that never should have been the starting point for a purpose-built competition machine, and after years of frustrating, expensive development, Ford's Motorsport division finally admitted defeat and killed the project in 1983. For most companies, that failure would have ended the conversation. Ford was already behind, already embarrassed, and already out of time. Instead, they made one of the boldest decisions in the company's competition history. They decided to start completely from scratch, and instead of adapting a road car into a race car, they were going to build a race car first and figure out how to make 200 road-legal versions of it second. To do that, Ford didn't turn to rally engineers. They turned to Formula One. They brought in Tony Southgate, a chassis designer who had worked on foam cars for teams like Shadow, BRM, and Arrows, and they paired him with John Wheeler, another engineer with a background in open-wheel racing. These were men who thought in terms of weight distribution, chassis rigidity, and aerodynamic efficiency, not the compromises of adapting an existing family car. And what they designed was, frankly, strange-looking on paper, but brilliant in practice. The engine, a turbocharged 1.8-liter Cosworth unit known as the BDT, was mounted in the middle of the car, right behind the driver, exactly where you would expect on a proper mid-engine race car. But then came the twist that made the RS200 completely unlike anything else in Group B. Instead of sending power backward from a mid-mounted engine the normal way, Southgate and Wheeler put the gearbox at the front of the car, which meant power had to travel forward from the engine to the transmission, and then a second drive shaft sent it all the way back again to the rear wheels. It sounds needlessly complicated, and mechanically it absolutely was. But the reason they did it was simple. It let them achieve something close to perfect 50-50 weight distribution, which, on a rally stage, where the car is being thrown sideways over crests and through blind corners at terrifying speed, is worth more than almost anything else you can engineer into a chassis. The construction of the car was just as serious as the layout. The lower structure was built from Ciba Geigy aerospace-grade aluminum honeycomb, the same kind of material you would expect to find in an aircraft, not a road car. The central tunnel and rear bulkhead were molded from a combination of Kevlar and carbon fiber, and the roof structure blended carbon fiber, aramid, and fiberglass together into a survival cell that was, for 1984, almost unreasonably advanced. The body itself, sleek, low, and aggressive, was styled by Ghia, and to save time and money in a rushed development schedule, Ford raided its own parts bin, borrowing the windscreen and rear lights straight off the Sierra, a completely ordinary family car. It's a strange thing to picture, a machine built with aerospace composites and Formula One thinking, wearing headlights from your uncle's company car. But that mix of desperation and brilliance is basically the entire story of the RS200 in one sentence. In road-going trim, built purely to satisfy the 200-car homologation rule, the RS200 produced around 250 horsepower, enough to be genuinely fast, but almost restrained compared to what was coming in full competition trim. That same 1.8-liter engine was pushed to somewhere between 350 and 450 horsepower, all sent through a four-wheel drive system that could put the power down in a way none of Ford's rivals could quite match. When Ford developed the Evolution version with a larger 2.1-liter engine built by Brian Hart, output climbed into the 500 to 800 horsepower range, depending on how aggressively the turbo was boosted, and one factory demonstration in an Evolution model produced a 0 to 62 mile-an-hour time of just over 3 seconds, a record that stood in the Guinness Book of World Records for more than a decade. Think about that for a second. In an era before traction control, before stability systems, before any of the electronic safety nets modern performance cars rely on, Ford built a car that could out-accelerate contemporary Formula One machinery, and then handed the keys to human beings and pointed them down a public road lined with fans. Before we get to Portugal, you need to understand something about the culture of Group B that television footage from the era never fully captures. These cars weren't just fast in a straight line. They were violently, almost unnaturally fast in every direction at once, capable of changing direction and accelerating out of a hairpin the way nothing on a public road had ever been able to before. Drivers openly admitted, some only years later once it was safe to say so, that certain Group B cars scared them, that they were driving right at the very edge of what a human being could physically process and react to in time, and the spectators loved every second of it. Hundreds of thousands of fans would travel to remote mountain stages specifically because there was no barrier between them and the action, because you could stand close enough to feel the heat off the exhaust and the wind off the car as it screamed past inches from your shoulder. For years, that closeness was the entire appeal of the sport. It felt raw, dangerous, and real, in a way modern, heavily sanitized motorsport rarely does. Nobody in a position of authority wanted to be the one to take that away, even as the cars kept getting faster every single season, even as the margin for error kept shrinking towards zero. Everybody in the paddock understood, on some level, that this arrangement could not last forever. Nobody wanted to be the reason it ended. Here's the problem, though, and this is the part of the story that people often skip past because it isn't as flashy as the engineering. The RS200 was late. Group B had already existed for 2 full seasons by the time Ford's car was fully homologated and ready to compete at the start of 1986. Audi, Lancia, and Peugeot had years of development, years of real-world data, years of drivers learning the limits of their machines. Ford was starting the fight in the final act, arriving at the party just as the lights were about to go out, though absolutely nobody knew that yet. The RS200's first real season did not go smoothly. At the Monte Carlo Rally, the opening round of the year, both factory entries retired with mechanical problems before they could show what the car was capable of. At the Swedish Rally, run on snow and ice where the RS200's short wheelbase actually suited the conditions, Kalle Grundle managed to bring his car home in 3rd place overall, a genuinely promising result, while the other factory car, driven by the legendary Stig Blomqvist, blew its engine and retired. It was a car with real potential, still finding its feet, still being pushed to its limits by a factory team that believed they finally had a machine capable of beating Lancia, Peugeot, and Audi at their own game. And then came Portugal. And everything about this story changes. The Rally to Portugal in March of 1986 was one of the most beloved and heavily attended events on the entire World Rally Championship calendar. Crowds in the hundreds of thousands lined the stages through the hills around Sintra. And this is the part you need to picture clearly, because it explains everything that happened next. These weren't roads with barriers, fences, and a safe distance between the cars and the crowd, the way modern motorsport events are run. Fans stood directly on the edge of the tarmac, sometimes leaning into the road itself to get a better view, sometimes darting across at the last possible second between cars, because that was simply the culture of the sport at the time. It had always been this way. It had always somehow worked out, until, on this particular morning, it didn't. Before Joaquim Santos ever got behind the wheel that day, there had already been a warning sign that the organizers chose to ignore. Earlier in the same stage, a wave of spectators surging forward had pushed a photographer directly into the path of a factory, Peugeot driven by Timo Salonen, the reigning world champion. The car struck the man, broke several of his bones, and sent his camera flying into the crowd in pieces. Salonen and his fellow competitors were furious. At the end of that section, drivers went directly to event officials and warned them, in no uncertain terms, that the crowd was completely out of control and that someone was going to get seriously hurt if nothing changed. The officials were told, and the officials did nothing. Not long after that warning was ignored, Joaquim Santos, one of Portugal's most respected homegrown rally drivers, a man who had spent years working his way up through the sport before finally landing a factory seat in the RS200 for what was supposed to be the biggest moment of his career, left the start line. The road ahead ran through a fast right-hand section that flowed into a tighter right-hander just over a small crest, a section the Ford was known to be taking at speeds well over 100 miles an hour in practice. And once again, standing right at the edge of that blind high-speed section was a crowd of people who had no real protection between themselves and the cars flying past. As Santos came through the corner, a spectator stepped out into the road directly in front of him. He had a fraction of a second to react, and he reacted the only way any driver would. He swerved to avoid hitting the person directly in his path. But in making that correction, at that speed, in a car with that much power sent through all four wheels, the rear of the RS200 broke away. His co-driver, sitting beside him with his head down reading pace notes, later described feeling the car go light beneath him, feeling it start to slide, and believing, right up until the very last moment, that Santos still had it under control. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. He said afterward that he felt it happening through his body before he understood it with his eyes. And then came a series of violent impacts, one after another. The unmistakable sound and feeling of a car hitting people. He said he never actually saw a single person in that crowd. Everything happened on the opposite side of the car from where he was sitting. All he felt was the car connecting with body after body after body before finally coming to a stop. 3 people lost their lives that day. A 36-year-old woman and 2 young boys, ages 9 and 13. The very first spectator fatalities in the 20-year history of that event. More than 30 other people were injured, several critically. And in one of the most damning details of the entire tragedy, even after competitors had informed race officials of exactly what had happened and pleaded for the stage to be stopped immediately, roughly 10 more cars were sent out onto that same stretch of road before the event was finally halted, and emergency crews were properly allowed in to help the injured. By that evening, every major factory team and driver in the World Rally Championship had gathered at a hotel in Estoril and signed a joint statement announcing that they would not continue in the event. It wasn't a statement blaming Santos, or blaming the Ford, or blaming the speed of the cars. It was a statement about the fans. The drivers said, in essence, that they could no longer guarantee the safety of the very people who came to watch them race, and that continuing under those conditions was something none of them were willing to do. Ford's own motorsport boss had already independently reached the same conclusion and pulled the team out before the drivers even finished drafting their statement. The rally continued without the factory teams and was eventually won by Renault, but the result barely mattered anymore. Something much bigger had just been broken, and everyone in the sport could feel it. If you think that was the low point of the story, the moment everything changed, I need to tell you something that makes this even harder to process. It wasn't over, not even close. Barely 2 months later, at the Tour de Corse in France, reigning Monte Carlo winner Henri Toivonen and his American co-driver Sergio Cresto were driving one of the most powerful and most feared cars ever built for rallying, the Lancia Delta S4, a machine that many drivers privately admitted terrified them even as they pushed it to its absolute limit. On a stretch of road that would later become infamous in rally history simply as Toivonen's corner, the Delta S4 left the road, plunged down a ravine, and burst into flames. There was nothing anyone could do. Both men died at the scene. Group B cars, built almost entirely from lightweight composites and carrying huge amounts of fuel for long competitive stages, could turn into infernos in seconds if the fuel cell was breached, and that is exactly what happened. Between Portugal and Corsica, the sport had lost 3 spectators and 2 of its most talented competitors in the span of a single season. The FIA's response was immediate and absolute. Group B was banned outright, effective at the end of that 1986 season, with no appeal and no transition period. The wildest, fastest, most technologically extreme era in the history of rallying was over, not because a rulebook slowly evolved out of existence, but because it was killed overnight in direct response to 2 catastrophic accidents that happened less than 10 weeks apart. And here is where the story of the Ford RS200 becomes genuinely tragic in a completely different way. A way that has nothing to do with the crash in Portugal at all. Ford had already been developing an upgraded version of the car for the 1987 season, an Evolution model with that larger 2.1-liter engine capable, in its most extreme tune, of over 800 horsepower. This was supposed to be the year the RS200 finally proved everything it was capable of. The year all of that Formula One engineering and aerospace-grade construction finally translated into real results against Audi, Lancia, and Peugeot. Instead, the ban meant the car Ford built to fight for championships never got to fight for anything. 24 of the original 200 cars were still converted to Evolution specification and sold to the public, technically making them road cars, but they were road cars carrying race-bred engines that were never going to see the stage they were designed for. It's one of the strangest fates in motorsport history. A car engineered by 2 Formula One veterans, built from materials taken straight out of aerospace design, capable of out-accelerating the fastest race cars on the planet at the time, and it never got to properly compete in the era it was purpose-built for. The RS200 arrived at the party just as the doors were being locked, and it never really got the chance to show the world what all of that brilliant, obsessive engineering was actually for. So what happened to the RS200 after all of this? In one of the more unexpected turns in its story, an RS200 Evolution went on, years later, to set that Guinness World Record 0 to 62 time of just over 3 seconds, a number that stood unbeaten for 12 years, quietly proving on paper exactly how capable this machine really was, long after anyone was watching. A handful of RS200s found their way into rallycross competition through the late 80s and early 90s, where a Norwegian driver named Martin Schonch even claimed a European title in one. Decades later, the car found an unexpected champion in Ken Block, who owned a heavily modified RS200 Evolution, producing well over 700 horsepower on pump gas, and openly called it his favorite car in his entire personal collection. Today, surviving RS200s are among the most valuable Fords ever built, regularly selling at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars, some crossing well past $500,000, prized by collectors specifically because so few were ever made, and because the car carries this exact story with it wherever it goes. But here's the twist I promised you, the piece of this story that most people leave out entirely. The RS200 itself was never actually found to be mechanically at fault for what happened in Portugal. Read that again. Every serious account of that day, including statements from the very drivers who signed a withdrawal letter, points to the same root cause: uncontrolled crowds standing in the road on a stage where organizers had already been warned and had already done nothing. The car didn't malfunction, the brakes didn't fail, the engine didn't explode. A human being stepped into the path of a car traveling well over 100 miles an hour, and Joaquim Santos did exactly what any of us would instinctively do. He tried not to hit that person, and in trying to save one life, the physics of a four-wheel drive rally car at that speed took over. The RS200 has carried the emotional weight of that tragedy for close to 40 years now, largely because it happens to be the car that was closest to the camera when the unimaginable finally happened. But the truth of that day is far more complicated and far sadder than simply blaming the machine. Think about the sheer scale of what these engineers actually accomplished in less than 2 years, starting from a failed program, with a fraction of the budget and experience their competitors had. They built a car with an aerospace-grade survival cell, a drivetrain layout nobody else in the category had even attempted, and a straight-line speed that outran contemporary Formula One machinery, and they did it by pulling in 2 men from open-wheel racing who had never designed a rally car in their lives. That is an extraordinary achievement by any measure, and yet almost nobody talks about that part of the story. Almost nobody remembers Kalle Grundle's podium in Sweden, or the sheer audacity of mounting the gearbox at the front just to chase perfect weight balance, or the record-setting acceleration run that stood unbeaten for over a decade. What people remember, what the car became permanently attached to in the public imagination, is 11 seconds on a Portuguese mountainside that the engineers who built it never could have predicted and never could have prevented. That's really what makes this story so hard to shake once you actually know it in full. This wasn't a car with a design flaw. This wasn't corporate negligence or a shortcut that got people killed. This was two Formula One engineers pouring everything they knew into building the most advanced rally car of their era, arriving right at the exact moment the entire sport was about to collide with its own limits, and getting caught forever in the history books as the machine present for the disaster that ended Group B. The RS200 never got its championship. It never got its proper era. What it got instead was a permanent place in motorsport history as both one of the most brilliant engineering achievements of the 1980s and one of the most misunderstood cars ever built, still carrying a reputation it never fully deserved. If this story hit you the way it hit me the first time I really understood the full sequence of events, stick around. Because the era that came after Group B, the birth of Group A, and the rise of cars like the Lancia Delta Integrale has its own story just as wild as this one, and you're going to want to hear exactly how the sport rebuilt itself from the ashes of everything you just watched.